The day I signed my name next to Jack Harrison's, my hand didn't even shake. I remember that clearly, how steady I was, how calm, like I was endorsing a check at the bank or signing for a package at the post office. Just another piece of paper, just another thing I had to do to keep what was mine. I stood in the county clerk's office in Stone Creek, Montana, wearing my dead uncle's watch on my left wrist because it was the only thing of his I carried with me every day, and I did not cry. I had promised myself I wouldn't, not here, not in front of strangers, not over a man who deserved better than my tears falling on a government form. Jack Harrison stood beside me like a fence post, tall, still, and completely unreadable. He wore a plain gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and boots that had seen better decades. He didn't look at me when the clerk spoke. He didn't look at me when he signed his name in that tight, deliberate handwriting of his, each letter placed like it cost him something. And when it was done, when the clerk stamped the document and slid it into a manila folder with the casual indifference of someone who processed paperwork for a living, Jack put his worn canvas jacket back on, gave a single nod to no one in particular, and walked out into the cold October morning like he'd just settled a fence dispute at the feed store. That was the agreement, nothing more than a deal. My uncle, Thomas Donovan, had died 6 weeks earlier. A heart attack in the middle of pruning season. Sudden, quiet, the way good men sometimes leave this world. One moment he was standing between the rows of Cabernet Sauvignon vines he'd planted 30 years ago, checking the sugar content of the grapes with that little refractometer he always carried in his breast pocket. The next moment he was on the ground, and the refractometer was rolling downhill between the vines, and the sky above the Bitterroot Valley was doing what it always did in late August, turning gold and pink like it was showing off for no one. He had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 9, drove all the way to Missoula to pick me up from the foster home, walked in without knocking and said, "Pack your things, Clara, you're coming home." I didn't know him well at the time. He was my mother's older brother, a man I'd met maybe twice at family gatherings I barely remembered. But I remember the way he said, "home," like it was already decided, like there was no discussion to be had. And somehow, that certainty was exactly what I needed. He taught me everything: how to read the soil by crumbling it between my fingers, how to know when the grapes were ready by smell alone, how to stand in the vineyard at sunset with a glass of something rough and red and feel like the whole world still made sense, even when it didn't. He was a quiet man with calloused hands and a dry sense of humor that only came out after his second beer. He never married, never had children of his own. I was it, his whole legacy, standing in the middle of 40 acres of vines that he'd built from nothing. He did not, however, leave a will. The lawyer in Helena had been polite about it, almost apologetic, the way people are when they deliver bad news they can't do anything about. He was a young guy, maybe 30, with a tie too expensive for his office, and a voice that softened at the edges when he said difficult things. But the words were the same no matter how gently they were delivered. Under Montana inheritance law, without a legal spouse or direct heir, and I was a niece, not a daughter, not in the eyes of the state, the property would enter probate, a process that could drag on for months, sometimes longer, a process that would almost certainly end with someone else owning Donovan Vineyards, someone who didn't know the difference between Pinot Noir and Merlot, someone who would see the land as a line on a balance sheet. I had 2 weeks before the bank could make its move. I spent the first week grieving. I walked the rows of vines until my boots wore blisters, talked to the empty house like Uncle Thomas could hear me, and sat on the back porch every evening watching the light drain out of the sky over the mountains, feeling like the ground beneath me was shifting in ways I couldn't stop. I spent the second week thinking, planning, calling every lawyer within a 100-mile radius, and getting the same answer in different voices. Without a spouse, the probate was unavoidable. The law was the By the 9th day, I was walking across the eastern fence line to the one neighbor who kept to himself enough that I trusted he wouldn't turn my situation into breakfast conversation at the Stone Creek Diner. Jack Harrison had lived on the adjacent 15 acres for as long as I'd been here. He'd come from somewhere back east, no one seemed to know exactly where, and had bought the land outright, cash, with no history and no explanation. He was a former merchant sailor, people said, had spent years on cargo ships crossing the Pacific, hauling grain and lumber between ports most folks in Montana couldn't find on a map. He was the kind of man who nodded instead of waved, who fixed his own roof and ate his own cooking and didn't seem to need a single person in the world to be happy. I respected that. More than that, I trusted it. I laid out the terms on his front porch like I was negotiating the sale of livestock. A legal marriage, nothing more. He would appear at the county office when needed, sign what needed signing, show his face in town often enough to keep up appearances. In return, I would handle everything else. No shared meals, no unnecessary conversation, no pretending beyond what the law required. Jack listened to every word without interrupting. He sat in his chair with his hands resting on his knees, watching me the way he might watch the weather rolling in from the west, patient, careful, not yet decided. Then he looked at me for a long moment and asked just one question. Why me? I met his eyes and said, because you don't talk. He almost smiled, almost. The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, like a crack forming in dry earth. This stays between us, he said. You run your land, I run mine. We don't owe each other anything beyond that. I agreed without hesitating. We shook hands across the porch rail. Neither of us smiled. And that was how I became Clara Harrison on paper, while remaining Clara Donovan in every way that actually mattered. At least, that was the plan. The first 2 weeks were exactly what we'd agreed on, distant, practical, and quiet. I kept to my side of the fence line. Jack kept to his. When I needed him at the county office, he showed up, signed whatever was required, and left without lingering. When the clerk asked how long we'd been together, I said, about a year, with a straight face, and Jack nodded beside me like it was the most natural thing in the world. He was good at that, being still, being present without being involved. It was the sailor in him, I think. Years of standing watch on empty water teaches you how to exist alongside something without disturbing it. We had the basics worked out before the ink dried on the license. No shared meals, no unnecessary conversation, no pretending beyond what the law required. It was clean, sensible, the kind of arrangement 2 reasonable adults could maintain without complications. And for 14 days we did exactly that. It was a broken fence that ended the distance. I had been fighting it since Monday. A section of the eastern perimeter had rotted through at the base, old wood, probably 15 years old, the kind of thing Uncle Thomas always said he'd fix next season. Next season never came. By Wednesday, the gap was wide enough for 3 of Hank Mercer's Black Angus to wander through and start treating my Pinot Noir rows like a salad bar. I chased them out at dawn, muddy boots and a lungful of cold air, and spent the next 2 hours dragging replacement posts from the shed to the broken section. By Thursday evening, I had splinters in both palms, a sore back, and one stubborn post that refused to sit level in the frozen ground. I was crouched in the dirt with a mallet in my hand, cursing under my breath, when I heard boots behind me. I hadn't called for him. Hadn't sent word. Jack had simply seen the problem from his side of the fence and walked over without asking permission. He crouched beside me, studied the post for a moment, then reached past me and twisted it a quarter turn. It dropped into place with a soft thud. I stared at it, then I looked at him. He stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "The hole's wider on the east side. Turn the post against the slope and it settles." Then he walked back toward his property like it was nothing. I watched him go and said nothing, but I didn't forget it. Small things have a way of adding up without permission. It started with the fence post. Then it was the Saturday morning I found my barn door swinging loose on its upper hinge, the pin half out, and by the time I came back with a hammer, it was already fixed. Jack's work, though he never mentioned it. Then it was me leaving a wrapped loaf of sourdough on his porch steps after I baked too. No note, no explanation, just bread. He left the empty plate on my fence post the next morning, washed clean and dried. Neither of us mentioned it. Neither of us stopped. By the end of October, there was a quiet rhythm to our days that hadn't been planned and couldn't be easily explained. Jack made strong coffee every morning. I could smell it drifting across the field when the wind came from the north, and had started making enough for two without thinking about it. I knew because one morning I found a thermos sitting on the fence post between our properties, still warm, with no note attached. I brought it back empty that evening. It reappeared full the next morning. I had started leaving my porch lamp on later than I needed to, not for any reason I was willing to name, just because the light felt right. Because the idea of him seeing it from his kitchen window, knowing I was still awake, knowing someone was there, it did something to the silence that I couldn't explain. And the town noticed before we did. Stone Creek was the kind of place where nothing moved without somebody watching. It was too small for secrets and too nosy for privacy. At the general store, old Mrs. Peabody, who had run the register since before I was born and treated gossip like a civic duty, told me that Jack had turned down a hunting trip with the Aldridge brothers because he had things to attend to at home. I smiled politely and changed the subject. But I thought about it the whole drive back to the ranch. Things to attend to at home. Our homes were separate. Our lives were separate. There was nothing to attend to that required his presence on my side of the fence. And yet, that evening I sat on my porch longer than usual, watching the last light drain out of the sky over the Bitterroot Range. The mountains turned from gold to violet to black, and the first stars appeared like someone had poked holes in the dark. And I made myself ask the question I had been avoiding for weeks. What exactly was happening between us? I didn't have an answer. I wasn't sure I wanted one. But for the first time since Uncle Thomas died, the silence around me didn't feel quite so heavy. It felt less like emptiness and more like company, and that scared me more than anything had in a long time. Because the deal was simple, the deal was clean. The deal was two people who didn't know each other anything. And somewhere between a fence post and a thermos of coffee, that deal had started to feel like something else entirely. Something I hadn't agreed to, something I wasn't sure I knew how to stop. His name was Lawrence Black, and he rolled into Stone Creek on a Wednesday morning in a black SUV with tinted windows and Montana plates that weren't from around here. He was tall, well-dressed for a man driving through cattle country. Pressed shirt, polished boots that had never touched a barn floor, and the silver watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. He had the kind of smile that made people instinctively check their pockets. I noticed it the first time I saw him, standing outside the post office, scanning the town like he was appraising it, like he was deciding what it was worth and who he could buy it from. He was a land developer out of Bozeman, that was what he told people. He bought struggling farms and ranches, properties that had been on the market too long or had never been on the market at all, and he flipped them. Luxury vacation homes for wealthy out-of-staters who wanted a taste of Montana without any of the work that came with it. Log cabins with heated floors, guest ranches with curated Western experiences. The kind of places that looked rustic in photographs and felt like hotels in person. He had heard about Donovan Vineyards through the county records office. A woman running a property that size alone, with a marriage arrangement that had no romantic history behind it, and a legal structure that smelled like desperation. Lawrence Black saw opportunity the way a hawk saw a field mouse, from a great height, with patience, and with absolutely no sentiment. He introduced himself to me at the feed store on a Friday afternoon, hat in hand, voice smooth as river water. He told me the vineyard was worth 3 times what I thought, that he had buyers, serious buyers, people from California and Washington State who would pay generously, and that a woman of my intelligence and talent deserved better than breaking her back over 40 acres of dirt in a valley where the growing season was 6 weeks shorter than it needed to be. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I asked him to move aside so I could reach the mineral supplements for my goats. He didn't give up easily. That was the thing about men like Black. They mistook persistence for charm. By the following week, he had made it his business to be wherever I was, the post office, the market, the Saturday morning farmers market where I sold my jams and early harvest grapes to the locals. He was never inappropriate, never aggressive, just persistently present in the way that certain men believed was endearing, and every woman I knew found exhausting. He started leaving voicemails on my phone, polite ones at first. "Just checking in, Clara, no pressure, but that offer won't be on the table forever." Then more pointed. "I'd hate to see a property like yours tied up in legal trouble. Probate can get messy. I know people who can help." The implication was clear. He knew about my situation. He knew about the will, the probate, the ticking clock, and he was positioning himself as the only way out. What he hadn't accounted for was Jack. It was a Wednesday afternoon, late in the second week of Black's campaign. I was coming out of the bank in town. I'd been inside trying to sort out a property tax question that the clerk couldn't answer, and Black was waiting on the sidewalk. He fell into step beside me like we were old friends, hat in hand, talking about market values and closing timelines. And then Jack was there. He was coming down the bank steps behind me. I hadn't known he was inside. He must have been in the back office, handling something on his own account. He stopped when he saw us. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked over and stood beside me. Not in front of me, not behind me, beside me, and looked at Black with that steady, unhurried gaze of his. The kind of look that didn't threaten anything. The kind of look that didn't have to. "She's not selling," Jack said. His voice was quiet, level, the way a man speaks when he's not asking for permission. "And she's not alone." Black's smile thinned. He looked at Jack the way a man looks at an unexpected variable in a calculation he thought he'd solved. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was all performance and no respect, and walked back to his SUV without another word. I stood on the sidewalk with my heart beating in my throat. 3 words, simple enough, the kind of thing a man said to protect an arrangement, to keep up appearances, to make sure a land developer didn't find a crack in the agreement and wedge himself into it. That was all it was. That was what I told myself until about 2 in the morning, when I stopped pretending and admitted that the way he had stood beside me had felt like something I hadn't felt since Uncle Thomas was alive. Like someone was in my corner without being asked. Like I wasn't handling everything by myself for the first time in months. I sat up in bed, pulled the quilt around my shoulders, and made a decision that felt equal parts sensible and dangerous. I needed to pull back. Whatever was quietly growing between us was not part of the agreement. I was not willing to let myself need someone who had only signed a piece of paper. I was cooler toward him the next 3 days, polite but distant. I stopped leaving the porch lamp on late. The bread stopped appearing on his fence post. I kept my eyes on my own rows, my own work, my own silence. Jack noticed. I could tell by the way he paused at the fence line one morning, coffee in hand, and looked toward my house for a moment longer than usual before turning back. He didn't push, didn't ask. He simply respected the distance I had reset. And somehow that made it worse. Because a man who honored your boundaries without complaint was far more dangerous to your heart than one who fought them. It was a fire that broke the wall completely, a small one at first. A dry patch of grass along the western fence line caught a stray ember. From what, I never found out. Maybe a passing truck with a dragging chain throwing sparks on the gravel road. Maybe a cigarette tossed without thinking. Montana in early September was dry as kindling, and the wind that day had been steady and warm, coming down from the ridgeline with the kind of heat that made the grass crinkle under your boots. I saw the smoke from the hill where I'd been checking the irrigation lines, a thin ribbon of gray against the blue sky rising from the direction of the old barn. The one Uncle Thomas had built in his first year on the property. The one I kept the winter feed in. The one with the hand-carved beam over the door that still had his initials burned into the wood. I was running before I had time to think. By the time I reached the barn, the fire had chewed through about 20 feet of dry grass and was licking at the base of the western wall. It wasn't big yet, but it was fast, and the wind kept shifting, pushing it in unpredictable directions. I grabbed a feed sack from the open doorway and started beating at the edges, stamping the flames down wherever they crept forward. The smoke burned my eyes and caught in my throat. Ash stuck to my arms and the sweat on my face. But the wind kept shifting, and the grass kept feeding it, and I was losing ground fast. I didn't call for Jack. I hadn't planned to call for anyone. I was used to handling things alone. It was the first lesson Uncle Thomas had taught me, and the one I'd learned most thoroughly. You don't wait for someone else to save your land. You save it yourself. But when I looked up through the smoke, he was already there, moving along the far edge of the fire with a wet blanket, cutting off its path to the barn with the kind of calm, focused effort that came from a man who didn't panic. He'd soaked the blanket in his horse trough. I could see the water trail leading back toward his property. He'd seen the smoke from his place and come running without hesitation, without being asked, without even knowing how bad it was. We worked together for 20 minutes without a single word. We didn't need words. I beat at the southern edge while he smothered the northern front. When the wind shifted east, he moved before I could call out. When a patch of grass flared up near the barn wall, I was already there with the sack. We read each other's movements the way people only could after months of quiet observation, months of watching each other work from across a fence line, months of small gestures and unspoken understanding. When the last of it died in the dirt, when the embers hissed out and the smoke thinned to nothing, and the only sound was the wind moving through the unburned grass, I sat down right where I was standing. My legs just gave out. The adrenaline that had been carrying me drained all at once, and what was left was shaking hands and a face covered in soot and the sharp, metallic taste of fear. Jack crouched beside me. I was not crying. Clara Donovan did not cry easily. I had proven that at my uncle's grave, at the lawyer's office, at the county clerk's desk when I signed my name next to a stranger's. But my hands were shaking, and my chest was tight, and I could feel something cracking behind my ribs that I had been holding together for weeks. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stayed there, close enough that I could hear him breathing, steady and calm, while everything in me was still racing. His shirt was smeared with ash. There was a burn on his forearm where a spark had caught the fabric, red and raw, and he hadn't even flinched. Then he reached over and covered my shaking hands with his. Just that. No words, no explanation. No, "Are you okay?" or "It's going to be fine," or any of the things people say when they don't know what else to say. Just his hands, rough and warm and steady, wrapped around mine. I looked down at them, at his fingers laced over my knuckles, at the ash on both our skin. And I felt every wall I had spent the last 4 days carefully rebuilding come down at once. I didn't pull away, neither did he. We stayed like that while the smoke thinned above us and the wind finally settled, and the Montana sky turned the deep, bruised gold of late afternoon. The mountains stood against the horizon like they had stood for 10,000 years, indifferent and ancient, and for once I didn't feel small beneath them. I felt seen. I felt held. I felt like the ground beneath me had stopped shifting for the first time since the day my uncle died. We salvaged what we could from the barn that evening. The western wall was charred but standing. Most of the winter feed was untouched. The fire had been stopped just in time. Jack helped me reinforce the damaged section with scrap lumber and sheet metal, working by the light of 2 battery lanterns as the sky went dark above us. We didn't talk about what had happened between us. Not yet. But something had changed, and we both knew it. The air between us was different now. Heavier, warmer, charged with something that neither of us had named, but both of us could feel. When he finally walked back toward his property that night, he stopped at the fence line and turned around. I was standing on my porch, watching him go. He looked at me for a long moment across the dark field, and then he said, "Leave the lamp on." Not a question, not a request, just a quiet statement, like he already knew the answer. I left the lamp on, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't pretend it was for any reason other than the truth. I wanted him to see it. I wanted him to know I was there, and I wanted him to come back. The first day of October came in cold and sharp, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and stayed there. Montana had turned the corner from late summer into something harder, something that demanded preparation. The aspens along the creek had gone gold almost overnight, and the mornings carried frost on the grass that didn't melt until after 9. I had been awake since before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hands, turning over the same thoughts I had been carrying since the night of the fire. Something had changed between me and Jack, and I could no longer pretend otherwise. The hand over mine, the way he had stayed without being asked, the way I had let him, the way he'd looked at me across the dark field and said, "Leave the lamp on," like he already knew everything I was too afraid to say. I had built this arrangement on the foundation of not needing any. It was the whole point, the reason I'd chosen Jack in the first place. He was safe. He was distant. He was a signature on a document and a name beside mine in a county filing cabinet. That was all he was supposed to be. And somewhere between a broken fence post and a barn fire and a thermos of coffee on a fence rail, that foundation had quietly, completely given way beneath me. The question was no longer what I felt. That part was settled. Had been settled, if I was honest, since the afternoon he stood beside me on the sidewalk and told Lawrence Black that I wasn't alone. The question was what I was willing to do about it, because admitting it meant risking everything. The arrangement, the vineyard, the careful distance that had kept me safe since Uncle Thomas died. I was still sitting there when I heard boots on my porch steps. I opened the door before he knocked. Jack stood in the gray morning light, hat in hand. His hair was damp. He'd showered, I realized, which was unusual for this early. He was wearing the clean gray shirt, the one he saved for town trips, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain. Not weak, not nervous, just honest in a way I hadn't seen from him before. Like he'd been up all night wrestling with something and had finally decided to stop wrestling. He said he'd been awake since 3. He said he'd tried to talk himself out of coming. He said he'd made coffee, poured it, let it go cold, poured another, let that go cold too. He said he'd stood at his kitchen window looking at my porch light, the one I'd left on, the one I always left on now, and realized he couldn't keep doing this. Then he looked at me steadily with those gray-blue eyes that had seen 1,000 miles of open ocean and 100 empty mornings and said, "I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement a long time ago, Clara. I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the fence post. Maybe it was the bread. Maybe it was the night you sat in the dirt after the fire and I realized I would have burned with that barn before I let you face it alone. I don't know. But I know I'd be lost without this life we've built, and I think you know that too." I felt the words land somewhere deep and permanent, like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples outward into places I had kept still for years. I stepped aside and let him in out of the cold. I put his coffee on, the real stuff, the good beans I saved for mornings that mattered. I set 2 mugs on the table, his black, mine with cream, and I sat down across from him and told him the truth. I told him I had stopped pretending long before the fire, that the porch lamp I left on late was never about appearances. It was about him, about wanting him to look across the field and know that someone was there, that someone wanted him to see. I told him I had tried to pull back those 3 days because I was terrified, not of him, not of what I felt, but of the fact that the last person I had allowed myself to depend on was buried on the hill behind the barn, and I wasn't sure I could survive losing someone like that again. Jack listened to every word without moving. His hands were around the mug still, the way they were always still. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint creak of the house settling in the cold. He reached across the table and took my hand, the same way he had in the field, steady, certain, like a man who had finally made a decision and was done questioning it. His thumb traced a slow line across my knuckles, and I felt something inside me unclench that had been tight for months, maybe years. We didn't make any plans that morning. We didn't talk about the vineyard or the probate or what we'd tell the people in town. We didn't need to. Those things would come, and we'd handle them the way we'd handled everything else, together, quietly, one day at a time. What changed was smaller than that, and more permanent. Jack started taking his meals at my table most evenings. Neither of us pretended it was about convenience anymore. He'd walk over at sunset, and I'd have something on the stove, and we'd eat without ceremony, talking about the vines or the weather or the coyotes that had been howling along the creek at night. He did the dishes without being asked. I never told him he didn't have to. We'd stopped negotiating the small things. We just did them. I stopped catching myself before I laughed at something he said. He stopped leaving right after the work was done. The distance that had once defined our arrangement hadn't just closed. It had disappeared so gradually that neither of us could point to the exact moment it was gone. By the time the first snow fell in mid-November, the vineyard was in the best shape it had seen in years. The eastern rows had been expanded, the soil had been tested and amended. I had plans drawn up for a second storage building come spring. Jack had helped me draft every page of it, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with coffee between us and lamplight overhead. And it had felt so natural that I looked up at him one evening and realized I could not imagine doing any of it without him. I didn't say it out loud that night. I didn't need to. He had looked up at the same moment, caught my eye, and held it. And in that quiet, unhurried look was everything that months of careful living had built between us. No paper had made this real, no agreement, no courthouse, no signed name. Just two people who had shown up for each other day after day, in small ways and large ones, until showing up became the only life either of us wanted.